In this module, we are going to discuss the terms fixed assets, capital assets, and property, plant, and equipment, and talk about which is the correct or proper or right term to use, if there is one. So property, plant, and equipment is an IFRS term. It's in IAS 16, and it says property, plant, and equipment are tangible items, and then there's a list of criteria, and they're held long-term. So they are tangible and not intangible items. IAS 38 talks about intangible items, which are patents and trademarks and things like that. So property, plant, and equipment are tangible. Now, one of the problems with property, plant, and equipment, and maybe we're being too picky, is you may not have a manufacturing plant, so you have only property and equipment. Or you might have only equipment. You have no land and building, you have no manufacturing plant, you only have equipment. So do you constantly edit the term? Do you have property and equipment? Do you just have equipment? Or are we being too picky? If we have a heading, property, plant, and equipment, and then we say, okay, we have a land, and we have building, and we have equipment, and we have this and that and the other, maybe people are going to understand and not be confused. Canadian Accounting Standards for Private Enterprises 3061 is titled Property, Plant, and Equipment, where it says they are identifiable tangible assets, and again they're long-term, and there's a list of criteria so you can determine whether something qualifies as property, plant, and equipment. Not intangible or goodwill, which are in 3064, and 306101 says property, plant, and equipment are tangible capital assets. And it also uses the phrase fixed assets several times. So it seems that even in standards, property, plant, and equipment, and fixed assets, and identifiable tangible assets are all kind of used interchangeably, perhaps. Now, one thing that's interesting as we think about the proper term to use, property, plant, and equipment and intangible assets are referred to collectively as capital assets. So the phrase capital assets is bigger than property, plant, and equipment, or bigger than fixed assets, because it includes intangible assets. So fixed assets and capital assets are not the same term. And I guess maybe you shouldn't replace the term fixed assets with capital assets unless the caption also includes intangible assets, goodwill, trademarks, and stuff like that. So if it's only property, plant, and equipment, capital assets may not be the correct term. Canadian Accounting Standards for Not-for-Profit Organizations, Part 3, talks about tangible capital assets. In 4433 and 4434, it talks about intangible assets. And then there's a special kind of capital asset, collections, in 4441. And it says examples of tangible capital assets include land, building, and equipment. So land, building, and equipment is a synonymous term for tangible capital assets. And again, the section uses the phrase fixed assets several times. So perhaps tangible capital assets, land, buildings, and equipment, and fixed assets are all synonyms, and one is not preferred over the other. Now, a solution to this issue is, I went and looked, and some public companies still use fixed assets. They assume that people understand that fixed assets and property, plant, and equipment are the same thing, and maybe fixed assets is a phrase that's understood better by users of financial statements than property, plant, and equipment, which is kind of a $64 word, perhaps. The other thing I noticed is some public companies use property, plant, and equipment, even though they probably have no manufacturing plant. So they're using it as a standard phrase not editing it to be specific to what their property, plant, and equipment is, because I guess when they go, okay, here's our property, plant, and equipment, land, building, equipment, that a reader will figure out what that is. So I was interested that public companies don't uniformly follow property, plant, and equipment and don't uniformly edit the phrase to be what they have. So, property, plant, and equipment is a phrase that is used by many, and they are fancy ifers words, and so you need to be careful, or maybe you don't, if you have no plant, because as I say, I found an example where someone with no plant continued to call it property, plant, and equipment. Tangible capital assets. Now, if you're feeling very fancy and you have a not-for-profit organization and you wish to follow the fancy Part 3 words, I suppose tangible capital assets is okay, but we're trying to communicate information to users, and as I say, civilians may not understand what we're talking about. So maybe that's a $64 word when a $2 word will work. So the phrase capital assets. Now that phrase includes both tangible and intangible assets. So if we've decided in a not-for-profit organization that we should be using the term capital assets and not fixed assets, perhaps that's wrong. It's not the NPO term. The NPO term is tangible capital assets. And again, this is the $64 word when a $2 word might be better. And in a not-for-profit organization, the users might better understand the phrase fixed assets as opposed to tangible capital assets. So I think I would say that using the phrase capital assets is probably incorrect, because we're going to want to describe our tangible capital assets and our intangible capital assets, and we're going to describe our intangible capital assets as goodwill or trademarks or whatever. So that's probably an accounting term, not a financial reporting term to help convey information to users. So probably not the phrase capital assets. And as I said, fixed assets used by many. It's used in IFRS only once, but they use the phrase fixed assets in IFRS. It's used in Part 2 and Part 3, and so it's commonly understood. I like the phrase fixed assets. We're trying to communicate information to users, and if we call something fixed assets, our users will probably get exactly what we're talking about. So what's best for land and building, etc., for tangible capital assets? I guess the number one choice is property, plant, and equipment. The slight complaint about that, is it too fancy? Is it going to be confusing to users? So I think fixed assets is a close second. Maybe they're even tied. Property, plant, and equipment, or fixed assets, whichever seems to be the best in the circumstance. Tangible capital assets, I just think, is too fancy, and so I would put that as a third choice, but way far down. 1 and 2 very close together, 3 far down. And as I said before, capital assets I think is kind of wrong if we're only talking about tangible assets, and as I said, calling them tangible capital assets I think is too fancy. So thanks for listening.